Okay. Good morning, Lionel. You're muted. Here we go. Unmute. There we go.
Right. How are you?
Oh, you look great. How are you doing this morning?
I'm fine, thank you. I've cleaned up the background a bit. I hope it helps.
You look fabulous, Lionel.
Well, you were worried about the chaos behind me, I know.
Well, you know, I have
I could turn it slightly as well. I don't know quite what.
no, that looks good actually, right? That angle.
Is that better?
I have a younger sister. Do you have any brothers? You have brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I have a brother and sister.
Well, my youngest sister, who's the youngest of five, and I'm the oldest of five, she's always taking shots at me. And she says, how can you do this? How can you do that? How can, what did you have in mind with this? And so she was talking about what we're doing, because it's kind of not her world, but she's watching it and she's doing all that. She says, what do you have all that? What's all that stuff up there? She says, you've contrived all this. I said, that's the way it is normally. That's the way my world is. She says, don't you know that when people are on these things, they don't look at the person. They look at everything that's in the background.
Yeah. You know, in Skype, you can blur the background, but there isn't a way of doing that in Zoom.
No, there's not. No, there's not. And now let me ask you a question. Okay, let's go back to you. I'm getting a big hit off of the artwork that's on the right hand, you're over your right shoulder.
Oh, my medicine Buddha?
Yeah, it is.
Do I get in the way? Oh, how about if I?
No, that's actually, yeah, that's actually a little better. It's got the sun. It looks like the sun is reflecting off of it. But no, that's not bad. What you have there is not bad. Gard will be with us in probably 1 minute, and then will join us. Now,
okay.
What thoughts do you have about how you would like this to proceed?
Well, I would like to start talking and show the PowerPoint at the same time.
Okay.
What I'm reluctant, and then have Gard, or is Will coming as well?
Yes. Yeah. I want to go back to the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Run the PowerPoint. I want to be sure we can do this flawlessly.
Actually, I sent it to you. Let me do.
But if I run it, it's one thing. But if you run it.
Okay. Let me just hit screen sharing.
Right.
Share screen. Here it is.
All panelists, there you go. Oh, wonderful. We're up.
Can you see that?
Yeah. It's only, there you go. Good.
Yeah. Okay. The only thing now I've lost you.
How
you are.
about up on the upper right-hand side?
Oh, there you are. Yeah. Okay. What I want to talk to Gard about this. He gave me this list of questions that he wants to talk about.
Okay.
But frankly, that's too much about me. I just want to talk about this material. I really don't want to talk about me.
Okay.
Because this is not about me. It's about the topic.
At this point in our evolution as the talks, I would be inclined to agree with you. I think that now how many you have 15 images. Now,
is that right? I don't know.
you have what I'm going to say? Yeah, it says at the bottom 15.
Oh, 15. Yeah.
Oh, I should go get my my Venus of Willendorf.
Oh, if you have one, that would be great.
Yeah.
But because that's actually a good example of
Yeah.
one of the main points I'll be
it's
talking
so little.
about.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
All right. See, there we are. Maybe I will clean up this. Put it right back there. Yeah, there you go. Have you been to Vienna and seen the original one?
I've been to Vienna, but I didn't know the original was in Vienna.
Yeah, it's in the one across from the Kunsthistorie Museum.
Oh yeah, I went to that museum. I may have seen it. I was there last year. There was a Jungian meeting there.
There we are.
Oh God.
Okay, now, Lionel, what I want you to do is press slideshow up at the top. There you go. Oh, they're right
wait
there.
a minute.
Right
slideshow.
there.
Yeah.
I think that if you press that, you can get rid of the title slides on the left, but maybe that's not a problem. Gard, I'm going to unmute you.
I've pressed slideshow, but nothing changed.
No, it didn't change, did it? Okay.
Well, if you go over to from the beginning.
From beginning.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Is that better?
Yes. Yeah, see, I think that's really good looking.
Yeah, much better.
Okay.
Much better, yes. Oh,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, now drop that out of awareness. Keep wherever it is that you are, but just kind of get rid of that and stop sharing the slideshow, but leave that where it is, because that's where we want to start.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay.
So
right.
there should be a thing that says stop sharing slideshow.
Well, I've just minimized the PowerPoint. Is that not okay?
No, it's still showing on my screen.
Oh, well, what should I do again?
Let's see.
Stop. Where does it say stop slideshow? Oh, I see. Shall I click the X that says close?
Sure.
Or does that, or what's that down arrow?
I want you,
no,
yeah,
good, yeah.
I want you to.
Shall I close it?
Yeah, close it.
That didn't do anything. Should I just close the whole thing and start again? Or click stop share?
Yes, click stop share. There you go.
Yeah, that's it. Right.
That's what we want to do.
That's what we want to do. And then we can share later. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Gard, let's see. Let's get Gard set up. Can you tweak your monitor to that way? Yes. And then a little bit more. I like the Shiva. If you can, like this, tweak it. Nope, the other way. There you go. Perfect. Perfect. It's so cool. I mean, you know, How you
says it
doing?
all.
How are you doing this morning, Gard?
We could just put it on Shiva, Lionel, and have a numinous experience for a couple of hours.
Yeah, but he sometimes can be a little destructive.
And restorative.
Now,
I prefer to think of him as the consciousness principle.
Yes.
I think that what I would like to do is open it up and without a whole lot of introduction, turn it over. Well, should I turn it over to you, Lionel, first, or Gard? How would you feel? Would you want to?
Let me just mention to Gard what I had in mind. Gard, you gave me this list of questions. I'm afraid that answering these questions would be too much about me. If you don't mind, I'd rather you and I talk about that in private sometime, but I'd like to go into this material.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And my thought would be to, as a way of acknowledging the audience, which is sitting out there. I didn't realize I had this capability, but we're not in view of the audience right now. And I initiated something called practice mode, which means the audience doesn't join until I press go.
Okay.
Once I press go, and I'm going to talk to us. So we're completely, at least as I understand this thing, because I don't see any participants or any attendees or anything like that. And I think once I hit broadcast at the top, it's everything comes out. All the animals go loose and everything. You know, we've opened the doors.
It's Jumanji.
Yes, Jumanji. Yes.
I don't know what that is. What is
some movie about jungles or something. You know.
Dana, I think you should open it up with brief introduction and then let Lionel step right in to the presentation.
That sounds good. And Lionel, as soon as you go, just start your lecture, talk for a little bit, and then go to the screen share, and we'll run it for as long as you need to go through that. Gard,
will Gard just interrupt with a question or a conversation? How do we do that?
I think that if you have a natural place where you think a question might go or something like that, that maybe you would transition to something that moves to Gard. Well, Gard, if you read.
The question for you, Lionel, is I know that sometimes I like to go through all my slides before I go to questions. How do you feel?
I don't care. That's fine. I mean, sometimes the questions are going to be answered in a subsequent slide. You know, that's the only thing.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes I prefer it just to allow you to give your presentation, and then I'll ask some questions based on that presentation, and then we'll open up to. Are you getting questions from the audience? Through the chat?
I would only say questions at the very end if we feel we have more time than we know what to do with. But my sense is that the quicker that we can find a way to involve Gard, the more sense all of us will make. Nobody expects to hear anything from me, and that's fine, you know, because I'm just simply, you know, the context for this happening. But
you're the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, and you're not supposed to be.
You're the man behind the curtain.
You're not supposed to be looking at me. So if you have a place where you want to invite Gard and you say, you know, not everybody feels this way. Gard, how do you think this? Because Gard has a wealth of spiritual traditions, has deep familiarity with your work.
But
so,
he may have a burning question as I'm talking. I mean, I think it would be fine for Gard to say.
Now, Gard, you do have the ability over here under chat.
Yes.
You know, and what he can do is he can send you, Lionel, a little private chat that nobody else sees. And it says, time to come to me. I have a question. Or how about this? Or something like that. So
maybe between slides, just a brief pause, because that may be an opportunity to say, well, you know, let's explore how dreams can be numinous, Lionel. Can you tell me, you know, in your, well, I'm not going to go to your personal experience, but in your experience of dealing with patients,
Yeah.
Dreams have really opened up a patient's experience of the inner life.
Yeah. Well, I have brought some numinous dreams with me. So
Lovely. That would be great. So, I mean, again, as you go through the slides, if there's just a brief pause after the slide,
yeah.
if there's a question there, it will emerge, as Rilke says.
Yeah. Oh, I'm trying to find the. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking for some dreams. I've got so many of them. I don't know quite which ones to.
Yeah.
And they're probably all hanging out there. We got four. Well, Will is a millennial, so he calls it close.
Yeah.
You know.
I see.
I think I'm going to. I think I'm going to focus on visionary experiences because I'll begin with one of my own because everybody talks about dreams, but hardly anyone talks about visions.
Yes. Great. I love it. Good.
So we'll be a little controversial.
Yeah. Why not? It's the.
I think though that visions really has that sense of the occult, and it has a sense of mystery. It has a sense that there's some divine providence going on.
Well, they are anomalous, so they're surprising, but they're not uncommon.
If you're okay with it, Lionel, I might bring up Jung's visionary experience toward the end of his life of kind of a worldwide sort of catastrophe.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we could maybe tie it into what's going on right now.
Oh, wait a minute. That was after the just before the First World War. He had that vision.
Well, he had that then, but then in 1960-ish, Marie-Louise von Franz reported that he had another visionary experience of an encompassing cataclysm that was global.
Did she say what it was?
No, there was no interpretation of the vision, but he had that vision, and you could refer back to his experience of World War I. But he had that vision, and it was a very powerful, numinous vision that he had.
Yeah. I did bring one of his, of the Green Christ. Yeah. Anyway, well, it's 9:28. Shall we?
9:28. I am going to open this up and then start setting up in front. So when I go, then it's going to go. All right. I have just opened it. Here come the participants. There is Will, I think. Nope, here they come. Yeah, see.
And you can hear us okay, Dana.
Yeah, they're flocking in.
Are you going to tell them about how they might ask questions?
Yes, yes, I'm going to cover some of that. Right now, they should assume that we are simply in the setup.
Okay.
That we have 14, some 15. They're just. I don't know the problem. I'm surprised it just didn't open up and get 80 people all of a sudden, like streaming through the doors. All right. Well, I'm not sure where Will is, but I'll tell you what. We still have one more minute, and then I am going to initiate the recording. Once I initiate the recording, what I'm going to do is announce what we're doing, introduce you, Lionel, and then I will turn it over to both of you. There he is. Did I call it? Runs in here. He acts like nothing's the matter, Here we are. Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to unmute Will. Good morning, Will.
Morning.
All right. Here we are.
Hi, Gard.
Oh, hello.
I am getting ready to initiate the recording.
Does yours still say it's recording?
Oh, okay. I don't know. I wonder how that happened. Oh, well,
Some wonderful person in the audience pointed that out.
did they?
Start again, Dana.
All right. Take two.
Getting it right.
Yeah, all right.
Learning patience with this thing.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dana White. And with me today, I have Dr. Lionel Corbett, Dr. Gard Jameson, Dr. Will Linn. And we are presenting today the first of a series of talks by Lionel Corbett. Today, it is called The Religious Function of the Psyche. Without a whole lot of introduction, let's turn it over to Lionel. And at the end, if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll go from there. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks very much, Dana. What I'd like to talk about this morning is Jung's approach to spirituality and religion, and try and show how his approach is very different than traditional Judeo-Christian approaches to spirituality. And in fact, in many ways, Jung's approach is actually completely incompatible with traditional religious systems. So it really is what I imagine to be a new myth of God. What I've done is focused on a particular kind of experience that was very important to Jung, that's called a numinous experience. So I want to begin by talking about numinous experiences. Let me see, is that showing up as a slideshow?
Yes.
So this is
From the beginning, Lionel.
oh, from the beginning. Thank you. I needed the, no, I'm clicking that, but nothing is happening. I'm clicking slideshow from the beginning. Oh, well, I can't seem to get it to work. Is that visible?
Yes.
Yes. I can't seem to get the slideshow to work, even though I'm... So this is roughly Jung's model of the psyche, and I'll try and show how it's relevant to religious experience. If you think of the psyche as a kind of what looks from the surface like an iceberg, at the tip we have everyday ego consciousness. This is the individual sense of me and you. Below that, we have the level that the Freudian tradition dealt with, which is repressed material from childhood, material that's shameful or painful or traumatic, and so on. What Jung did, which was very original, was to describe a level below that level, below the personal level, which he calls, it has several names. It's sometimes called the objective psyche, the autonomous psyche, the mythopoetic level of the psyche, the collective unconscious, many names for it. But the point is that this is the source of all the gods and goddesses and religious experiences of all the religious traditions of humanity. It's the spiritual dimension of the psyche. And for Jung, this is where religious experience originates. So in contrast to traditional theistic ideas about God, religious experience doesn't arise in some heavenly realm, somewhere else. It arises deeply within our own subjectivity from these deep levels of the psyche. So what that means is that if you can imagine that each of these little iceberg figures is a human being, so there would be 7.5 billion of them on the planet, all of us participate in this deep level of the psyche. And what that means is that imagery from any religious tradition can emerge into the individual psyche. It doesn't matter what the religious tradition is that you grew up in, because just by virtue of being human, you may dream of any god or goddess or religious imagery, not only from current religions, but also from archaic religions. So you may have been born in North America, let's say, but you may dream of a Hindu god or goddess or an ancient Egyptian god or goddess. because all that material, as it were, is stored in this deep level of the psyche. So what Jung is doing is recalling the gods and goddesses to their original source in the deep level of the psyche. Let me go to the end of this to just give an example of what this looks like. This is the dream of a man who was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition, was actually a Roman Catholic priest, and all his life he'd been worshipping the divine in the usual, in his very traditional way. And to his enormous surprise, one day he had a dream in which this figure appeared to him in the sky above him. Now, normally this figure is only, I think, 4 or 5 inches tall. I think, Dana, you may have one in your collections. There are many copies of it. This is the Venus of Willendorf. It's from old Europe. It's dated to about 20,000 years ago. But in his dream, rather than being a tiny clay figure, she appears as an enormous goddess in the sky above him. And what happens in the dream is that he's holding a communion cup. He lifts it up, and then milk starts to pour from the breast of this goddess figure into the cup. And he says, I realized in the dream I was in the presence of something extremely holy. Now, this is completely surprising to him. This is not, obviously, this is not a Christian God image. It's pagan. If anything, it's way pre-Christian. Now, why is this relevant? This is a very good example of how imagery from this deep level of the psyche popped up into this modern man's consciousness in a dream. Now, how does Jung talk about this kind of religious experience? He draws on the work first of all, of a theologian called Rudolf Otto, who wrote a book called Das Heilige, the Holy, in 1917. This book, by the way, is still in print. It's translated as The Idea of the Holy in the English translation. And to talk about this kind of experience, Otto coined the term numinous. This is a word that comes from a Latin noun, numen, which means a god or a divinity. And Otto thinks that the source of all our religious experience comes from direct experiences of the sacred or the holy. And the important point is that they have a special quality, a special emotional quality. Otto is talking about experiences like Moses at the burning bush, or Saul's experience on the road to Damascus, Job's experience of the whirlwind. Now, Otto says what all these experiences have in common, and what that dream image also has in common with these experiences, these biblical experiences, is that these experiences have a special emotional quality. Otto was basically a 19th century scholar, so he used this Latin phrase, mysterium tremendum et fascinans, meaning a mystery that's overwhelming and fascinating. And when people have these kind of experiences, and they're not confined to the founders of the tradition like Jesus or Moses or Muhammad, these happen to ordinary people quite regularly. I'll give you some more examples. And when people have these kind of experiences, they use words like awesome, dreadful, terrifying, ineffable, uncanny. There's a sense that one is in contact with something completely unusual. So they're so emotionally powerful that you can imagine what it must have been like for Moses to talking to God out of a burning bush, or Saul on the road to Damascus, hearing Jesus's voice saying, "Why do you persecute me?" They make the subject feel very small. Sometimes the individual feels blessed. Sometimes these experiences are terrifying. They can be the source of religious experience, and so on. We can't control these kind of experiences, and Otto thinks that they are completely an original type of experience. They can't be understood rationally. Now, this slide's a little dense, I'm sorry. I think I'll skip some of the questions that arise with regard to Otto's work, or whether we can be quite sure what the source is of these experiences, but I think that's perhaps not necessary for our present purposes. The importance of Otto is that Jung borrowed Otto's concept 20 years later in his Terry lectures at Yale University. These were held every 4 years. They were on the psychology of religion. And in his lecture, Jung pointed out that he's hearing experiences with this emotional quality in the consulting room, but he pointed out they aren't necessarily taking a Judeo-Christian form. He was hearing experiences like that Venus of Willendorf experience, which is obviously not Judeo-Christian, but for the dreamer, it was extremely numinous. It was mysterious, tremendous, fascinating. So what Jung decided is it doesn't matter what the content of the experience is, only the emotional quality of the experience is important. And as I said before, you may experience this kind of imagery in a very surprising way, not necessarily from the tradition that you grew up in. Now, so Jung and Otto both agree that these experiences are experiences of the holy or the sacred. But there's a huge difference between them because Otto thought these experiences came from a kind of heavenly realm, from the transcendent God of Christianity or Judaism. Whereas for Jung, these are experiences of that deep mythopoetic level of the psyche, which is the source of all religious experience. So for Jung, these experiences come from a level which is much more immanent. Whereas for traditional Judeo-Christian theists, these come from a transcendent realm. For Jung, the sense of transcendence that these experiences produce really arises because they are what we would call non-ego. We're very unfamiliar with them. The experience of the deep level of the unconscious has that effect of being that we're in touch with something wholly other, wholly transcendent. But it's not transcendent in the sense of being in a heavenly realm. And of course, traditional theists would not accept an image like that Venus of Willendorf as something holy or sacred. They would say at best it's pagan. But for Jung, these are simply forms of individual revelation. Now, this is another point of controversy because traditional religionists, traditional theists would say that revelation has stopped. Say at the end of the writing of the New Testament or with the end of the Hebrew Bible or whatever, that there's no more revelation. But for Jung, these kind of experiences go on and on and on. You could have one in your dream tonight. So the man who had that Venus of Willendorf image in his dream was granted what Jung would call a personal or an individual revelation. And obviously there's an important symbolic meaning to him, which is that the divine appears to him in the form of the sacred feminine. So he may have been, he was actually worshipping largely a male sky god, but sometimes one's real religious feeling emerges in a numinous experience that acts as a kind of a course correction. Really, this man is a devotee of the goddess or the sacred feminine or the queen of heaven, however you want to talk about it. Actually, when I asked him whether he talked about any this experience with any of his colleagues, he said no, because it would cause too much controversy. He was actually in a religious order. And very often when people who are committed to a particular tradition have these kind of experiences, they're a little bit shy of talking about them. Now, why are these experiences important? Jung thought that these experiences have a healing effect. In about, I forget if it was 1944 or 45, something like that, he had a serious heart attack and he was in a kind of a toxic delirium for a few days. And he had a very powerful out-of-body experience that was extremely numinous. And after that, he wrote a letter in which he said that he thought that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy. And the reason he said that is that numinous experiences often address an issue in the subject's life. Sometimes they talk about a developmental a difficulty, a complex, a life crisis that the person has. And they have such tremendous emotional intensity that they can even be helpful with very painful complexes. I just want to mention one more theorist in this area that I think is very important. William James also wrote about these kind of experiences in his Varieties of Religious Experience. But he had a different set of criteria, which are also very helpful. He said the experience is ineffable. It's hard to describe the emotional quality in words. He said the experience is noetic, which is a word that's not used very often. It means it tells you something that you didn't know before. And he pointed out that these experiences are transient, they don't last very long. And of course, you can't make these experiences come and go. You might be able to prepare for them with spiritual practice like meditation or prayer or pilgrimage and so on. These kind of spiritual practices might make the experiences more likely to occur, but sometimes they just occur spontaneously. And there's no guarantee that whatever practice you do, these experiences will occur. They are. That's why Jung calls the deep level of the psyche the autonomous psyche. We can't control it. Now, this is an important aspect of. Oh, maybe before I go on to talk more about this, are there some comments from Gard or Will about this so far?
Well, Lionel, thank you so much.
Yep.
Your presentation as a student at Pacifica really affected me, and I want you to know in all my classes I bring the religious function of the psyche into play. My question for you is this idea of personal religious experience. I know Jung didn't deny the transcendent, but he just said we need to focus on the psychic fact of what's in front of us. In other words, the dream or the vision or the experience of the numinous. Can you speak a little bit to this idea of personal religious experience? What does that mean to the individual who's having it?
Well, it can mean many things. I mean, sometimes it points to the individual in a direction that is different than the tradition in which the person was raised. In that example of the Venus of Willendorf, this was a total surprise to this man. He had no idea that the essence of his spirituality had to do with the divine feminine. He had in other words, it produced a radically different change in his God image. It doesn't mean that he literally worships the Venus of Willendorf. They are thought, by the way, those figures to be the earliest known images of the goddess. It's not completely certain that they were, but that's a common theory. It's a symbolic gesture telling him to move in the direction of the divine feminine and not to think of the divine in terms of a male sky god. So it can have that kind of effect. Also, it can have this kind of healing effect. And in people who've had no religious orientation, these kind of experiences can produce a religious conversion. So they can have a very profound effect on the personality.
Thank you.
Well, Lionel, I'd like to express appreciation and also like to ask a question that might help me some. First, I just want to say that it's really obvious to me how valuable this conversation is right now. I think that when you're calling for the numinous as a guide for our own lives, when you're pointing out the fact that that's where the real healing is, I think it's a really important message in a time where many of us feel not only lost, but not sure where to look. And, this encouragement, this discussion about, looking in and looking to the true guide right now and finding the numinous is contextually relevant even without, directly talking about it. And with that, I, like many of us, am feeling myself very deeply in this space where I'm touching base with myself. I'm having a lot of numinous experiences in the last month, and I suspect I'm not the only one. But I also know that these type of numinous experiences, when you start to open a relationship with the symbolic in your life, with the numinous, there's also a real danger of doing that on your own and slipping into madness. And so on one level, it feels spiritual and it feels valuable, and I'm finding things. And on another, I'm finding myself wanting to be extremely vigilant in relationship to my own psyche. So if you had any pointers.
Yeah,
On
well, thank
post.
you. Well, you raised several important points. One is, as it says on this particular slide, that if you over-identify with a numinous experience, it can make you either very inflated or even psychotic. And there's no doubt that these experiences can trigger psychosis in very vulnerable people, especially when it's a type of experience that we call a visionary experience, which is like a dream except you're awake. It seems to be that you're in a dream that's happening on the outside. And I'll give some examples of that, because they're not all that uncommon, but they're rarely talked about. And when people have them, they're afraid that they've gone psychotic or something. But there's a big difference between saying I've had this experience and I am the experience. This man didn't say I am the Venus of Willendorf. That would make him psychotic. If you relate to it, and especially, as I say here, if you express it in an individual way, writing, painting, dancing, some expressive modality, then you relate to it, and then it doesn't possess you, and then you don't become inflated. So Jung thinks that you have to take a stand in relation to the experience. So I'm glad you raised that point. And there is always the issue of what is the relationship between having one of these kind of experiences in the waking state, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, who heard Jesus's voice saying, "Why do you persecute me?" That kind of experience can be reduced very easily. In his case, people have said he must have had temporal lobe epilepsy, which often produces religious experience. Or, you can say Moses in front of the burning bush was hallucinating, or it was an example of what's called pareidolia. When you look into the flames, sometimes or clouds, you can see faces, and so on. So it's very easy to reduce these kind of waking experiences, waking visions, like Moses or Paul. It's very easy to reduce them to some kind of brain aberration, or some kind of accusations of what were you smoking, that kind of thing. But if Jung and Otto are correct, these are what Otto calls sui generis. That means one of a kind. They're not reducible to psychosis or a hallucination or an overheated imagination or hysteria or something like that. Well, we can, if you want, we can go into this issue of psychosis a little further. But for the time being, I just want to say that these things happen to perfectly normal people, and as William James said, they can be quite transient. So this issue of waking visions is very important in the context of the different ways that numinous experiences can manifest themselves. The dream is the commonest manifestation. And I can give you some other dream examples if you like. Synchronistic events are also very numinous sometimes. Synchronistic events occur when one's psychological state corresponds to an event in the outer world, so that the inner and the outer, in an intensely meaningful way, so that the inner and the outer are seen to have to no longer be distinct, and that really links the inner and the outer, and it links matter and spirit. They're very important experiences. And then the example of waking visions is very important, and I better give an example of that in a moment. And then there are people who experience the numinous in the natural world or through the body. Let me just give an example of a numinous dream, pardon me, and explain how they can have how these experiences can have a healing effect. So this was the dream of a woman who had a serious mother problem. Her mother was very critical of her, didn't like the fact that she was a woman, and was critical of her body and so on. And as I said before, the reason these experiences can be healing is that they can directly address this kind of psychological problem. This is obviously what we call a negative mother complex. So here's the dream. I'm in a glass elevator that has no visible cables, heading up into space. The sky is clear blue. I can see for hundreds of miles. I'm pressed up against a group of beautiful otherworldly women who are swaying and singing a mesmerizing melody. We are naked. They lift me up, they hold me, stroke me, and embrace me. They sing of love, compassion, and forgiveness. There's a feeling of intimacy. They begin dripping honey on me, which feels loving and sweet. I'm filled with incredible peace and joy beyond words or description. Now you can sense from just that last sentence that this dream meets Otto's criteria. It's mysterious, it's fascinating, it's a tremendous, emotionally powerful experience. And it had a profoundly healing effect on this painful mother complex. You can see that it stresses the beauty of the body, of her body and the women's body who surround her, who are celebrating the body. And the way they embrace her and care for her is directly antithetical to the way she was treated in childhood. And this image of having honey dripped on her is extremely important, not simply because of its obvious symbolic meaning about sweetness, but also because this is a good example of how mythic imagery can appear in the dream imagery of a modern person. In the goddess religions of antiquity, honey was used as an initiatory meal. It's not surprising that the devotees of the goddess in antiquity were called the Melissae, or the bees, because honey is a very powerful expression of the transformative effect of nature. The bee takes in pollen and it transforms it into a food, just as mother takes in food and transforms it into milk. This mystery of the transformative power of the feminine is symbolized by honey. So so that's why honey was used as an initiatory experience for devotees of the goddess. So this dream not only compensates for the woman's painful mother complex, but it also initiates her into a whole new level of appreciation of the female body and of being a woman. And very commonly, numinous experiences actually have an initiatory effect. What I mean by that is they move the person into a new level of consciousness. That's a very common concomitant of these kind of experiences. And this has an extremely helpful effect on someone with this kind of problem. That's what Jung meant when he said that these experiences have a healing effect. And Jung said these experiences are powerful, and that's why they're helpful. As he says, there's the quote, "The thing that cures a neurosis must be as convincing as the neurosis. And since the latter is only too real, the helpful experience must be real." So that's a very good example of a healing experience, a healing numinous experience. I think that's the end of my PowerPoint. So I'm just going to stop sharing it now and come back to Zoom. Has it disappeared?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
Lionel, I have a question, which
Yes.
as Otto describes the numinous, it's not necessarily always blissful and joyous and wonderful.
No, you're quite right. It can be terrifying.
But
Absolutely.
is there a sense of assurance that comes on both sides of that coin? Or how does the terrifying experience of the numinous, is it compensatory? How is that relevant to personal religious experience?
Well, let me use that question as a segue into the issue of visionary experiences, which are often very frightening. And so what I'd like to do is talk about a visionary experience of my own. And I'm doing this deliberately because when people have these kind of experiences, they're often very reluctant to talk about them. And I think it's about time we opened up discussion about the visionary experiences and not think that they're very peculiar or indicative of psychosis or something like that. So a visionary experience is like being in a waking dream. The experience seems to come from the outside. So Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, or Moses at the burning bush, this is what I mean by visionary experiences. So what happened to me happened about 11 years ago or so. I was lying in bed when this happened. It happened during the night. I know that I was wide awake, and I suddenly had the sense that there was a figure standing next to my bed. It was a tall, gray figure. It looked like it was made of stone, but it was obviously alive. And when I looked at this figure, I saw that it had three faces. There was a face looking down at me and a face coming out from either side of its head. It was extremely terrifying, to address your question. You know, one doesn't have these kind of experiences in one's bedroom. I mean, this was, but certainly it met Otto's criteria. It was quite transient. So as James said, it didn't last more than a few seconds, but it was very distinct. So it was mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, awesome, dreadful, uncanny, you know, whatever words one would like to use. And I had no idea what it meant. I didn't think that I was crazy or hysterical. I hadn't been smoking anything, so I had no idea what this was about. So I started to research this kind of figure. And basically, to cut a long story short, it turns out that there are many archetypal figures that have either three heads or three faces. They're called tricephalic figures. And there's a wide range of them. The Buddha sometimes appears with three heads or three faces, Hecate and Cernunnos. There's quite a range of mythic imagery. For various reasons that I won't go into, I decided in consultation with colleagues that this was an image of the mythic Hermes Mercury, who also appeared often with three heads or three faces. Now, the importance of that figure is that he was a messenger figure. He was a herald. When the gods on Olympus wanted to send a message to mortals, he would carry the message. So I realized that this was a message, but I didn't know what the message was, except that I had a sense that it might be something frightening, which it was. A month later, I developed a very serious illness from which I nearly died. So this was obviously sent as a warning that something was going to happen. Now, can we say that this was helpful? At the time, I didn't know what to make of it, but in retrospect, the way it helped me is it made me realize that there was some kind of background intelligence going on that knows what's going to happen. Jung thinks that there are realms of the psyche which are outside of time and space, and that's why we have prospective dreams and this kind of imagery which announce what is going to happen. And prospective dreams or prophetic dreams are actually not all that uncommon. I don't like the idea that life is a tale told by an idiot. I prefer to think that there's a kind of background archetypal intelligence, the intelligent order of the universe, and that this knew that something was going to happen to me. And I found that helpful. I found that reassuring. There is a whole other debate here about how the illness fits into the individuation process and so on, which I think might take us slightly off the subject.
So Lionel,
Yeah.
Jung had his own waking visions prior to World War I.
Yes, yes.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about that? And I believe at the end of his life, he had another vision of a worldwide catastrophic event, which Marie-Louise von France says in his vision didn't encompass the whole world. It didn't destroy the planet, but it was a worldwide.
We don't know any details about that vision, do we?
Just she was reporting in the interview that toward the end of his life, he had this vision.
Yeah.
And there's part of me that maybe wants to say maybe we're kind of in that apocalyptic moment right now.
Yeah. And the one just before the First World War was a vision of sheets of ice covering and destruction covering Europe. I've forgotten the details, but I know the one.
And the rivers were full of red blood.
Red blood, yeah. So he had that kind of visionary sensibility, obviously. And they're probably, these kind of experiences are probably still occurring, but we don't have a forum to talk about them. That's actually why I started this little organization, Psyche and the Sacred, so that people would have a place to talk about these kind of experiences, because it's actually very difficult. When you have one of these experiences, it's hard to know who to talk to. You know, there's an old saying that the difference between the mystic and the schizophrenic is that the mystic knows who not to talk to.
Can you talk a little more about the forum you've created in case anybody listening would like to tap into that?
Yes. Well, it has two components to it. Usually on Friday night, I give a talk like this one, where I talk about some of the ideas. And then on Saturday and Sunday, we meet in a small group, maybe 10 or 12 people, and we simply sit around and share dreams and these kind of experiences. And it's intended to be a contained way of talking about them. You see, people very often, when they have these kind of experiences, they can't go to their minister. Sometimes I've had the patients that I've worked with in therapy who've had very powerful numinous experiences, but because they were not traditionally Judeo-Christian, they were dismissed. For example, I remember a dream of a woman who dreamt of Jesus as a woman, and her minister told her that this was sent by the devil to deceive her. Now, he was obviously a bit of a fundamentalist, because obviously that dream has powerful symbolic meaning. The divine has a feminine aspect as well as, and so on. It wouldn't be hard to unpack it, but it's the more fundamentalist wing of the tradition will, especially if you have a very rigid Christology, only wants to accept very traditional religious experience. Whereas what Jung does is he widely expands the range of numinous experiences. And he does it purely, the criteria for knowing that something is an experience of the sacred or the holy is only this emotional quality of numinosity, not the content. So, for example, I once had a very powerful dream of an enormous UFO, something of the size of that Close Encounters UFO, that came down and hovered a short distance above my head. And the thing was so big and so close that was very terrifying. And then lights started to shine down on me. And when I looked up, I saw that the base of this UFO was covered in eyes, and the light was pouring out of the eyes. Now that dream was quite frightening, quite awesome, mysterious, terrifying, dreadful, you know, all those. So it meets Otto's criteria. So Jung would certainly say this was a numinous experience. And Jung would say this is an experience of the self with a capital letter S, meaning what he calls the God within, an internal image of the divine that is a priori. A priori means it's not internalized. It's present all the time at birth. It's not the result of experience. Why do I say it's a self symbol? because it's mandala shaped. It's a perfect mandala. You remember that the mandalas are highly symmetrical diagrams, usually combinations of circles, squares, and crosses, but they're always very symmetrical. So a UFO like that is a perfect mandala.
Yes, in
And,
Dreams and Reflections, didn't Jung have an experience of himself as an eyeball, experiencing the universe?
Oh, yeah, in that vision that he had after the heart attack, he was above the earth looking down on it. Yes, that's right. Yes. So the point I was trying to get at was that traditional Judeo-Christian theists would not accept a dream like that as an experience of the inner divine, but Jung would. Jung would say this dream is a dream of the self, the transpersonal self, the self written with a capital letter S, as distinct from the personal self, yourself and myself. And any of us can have a numinous experience of the self at any time. You may go to bed tonight and have one. And it may not take a Judeo-Christian form. And this is why, but it can act as a revelation. In that case, there's a teaching that, remember that one of Otto's criteria of, William James's criteria was the noetic quality, the quality of giving you information. The information here is, you are seen by that, where that has a capital T. So perhaps that was compensating for a feeling of not being seen, and so on. One could keep amplifying the dream, but they're not random. These experiences are always tailored to the individual's experience.
Well, I'm curious, in indigenous traditions, they would often go down to the river, or they would gather around the fire, and they would talk about their dreams in the morning.
Yeah.
What is it about modern culture that we're afraid to do that? Is it the development of the ego structure, or what?
Well, it's because modern culture doesn't understand what Jung referred to as the reality of the psyche. When you have a dream, it's very easy to dismiss the dream as, quote, nothing but, as if it's not significant. It's only psychological, as if that means it's not real. One of Jung's very major important points is that the psyche is real. So that a dream image is an image of something real. It has its own ontological existence. And that level gives you information that's as real as the information that you get from the five senses and from the intellect. It gives you real information. So the notion of the reality of the psyche hasn't penetrated into the culture. That's very unfortunate.
And why do you think that is from a developmental standpoint? I mean, indigenous cultures were very permeable, and they appreciated these dreams, and they, I believe, differentiated between big dreams and small dreams.
Yeah, well, you're a philosopher. I mean, the culture and the academy is Aristotelian.
Yeah.
This is a Platonic mode of being. It's a two-world theory.
Yeah.
We live in the everyday, ordinary, consensual reality, but there's a subtle realm or a spiritual dimension that's not immediately accessible to the five senses, but does erupt into ordinary awareness in these kinds of ways. And that's not a popular view in academic circles. So Jung's notion that there's a spiritual essence in the personality would be unpopular in most university circles, because they don't like essentialist theories. And this is an essentialist. Now, if you don't believe there's a spiritual essence to the personality, this will all be nonsense. So that's really a matter of one's own commitments. I think there's good empirical evidence. I think Jung, in some ways, was an empiricist and a phenomenologist. He's just describing, anyone can have these experiences and we can describe them. There's nothing mystical about them. Jung was often accused of straying from his lane into theology instead of staying in psychology. But he said, look, I'm just talking about people's experiences. That makes me a psychologist. Now, if you, there was a point you raised before, which is, what is the relationship between these intrapsychic experiences, like the UFO or the the wonderful dream of the women in the elevator. Is there any relationship between those kind of images and the transcendent God of Judaism and Christianity and Islam? I mean, is the self, the image in the psyche that we experience, an image of what the theologians are talking about? Or can we know? I think Jung probably privately believed, well, he said actually somewhere that our images are images of something. He said there is an original beyond the image that the image is pointing to, but you can't really prove that. It's a matter of belief. So for a lot of Jungians, these kind of experiences are experiences of the inner divine, but you couldn't be 100% certain that that the dream image tells you anything about the transcendent God of the theistic traditions. We just have to live with uncertainty. But I'm happy with what we've got. I mean, it's just as you cannot say whether the deep levels, the mythopoetic levels of the psyche are generating religious experience, or whether there is a transcendent God beyond the psyche, which is using the psyche as a kind of medium of transmission. Jung got into all kinds of arguments with Martin Buber and Victor White and various theologians who accused him of, Buber accused him of psychologism, meaning that he was reducing the transcendent God of the theistic traditions to, quote, nothing but an intrapsychic image. And Jung said, look, Martin, you just don't understand that these images are real. They could never resolve that kind of tension. And I think it's still a tension.
There's a lovely line from Lao Tzu that suggests that when people lack a sense of awe, there will be disaster. Would you reflect upon that personally and collectively?
Well, the sense of awe is one of the main characteristics of numinous experiences. And actually, I skipped over the slide that talked about some of what are called the epistemological problems with Otto and Jung, which is the problem of how can you say what the source of these experiences is. If I'm watching a tremendously powerful sunset and I'm awestruck, or I look into the skies at night and I see these wonderful stars and I'm awestruck, some skeptics would say, well, you're awestruck by the power of nature. It has nothing to do with God. So
Sorry.
It's so interesting when these interruptions occur, isn't it?
Yeah, my apologies. I don't know.
That's all right. No. Maybe it was just a little musical background to the conversation.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's possible to reduce these kind of experiences and not attribute them to experiences of the divine. It's possible to just say they're natural phenomena. They have no special religious significance.
You think when we deny those experiences or when we reduce those experiences, as Lao Tzu says, we're going to experience a higher degree of neurosis or complex in our lives?
Well, I think that having a spirituality is very helpful in dealing with psychological difficulties. Jung, you remember, felt that when people came to see him who were in midlife or past midlife, that they had to develop some kind of spiritual attitude to their difficulties, that it was insufficient to try to solve the problem at its own level. It really needed a spiritual background. He didn't mean that you had to belong to one of the creedal systems. You don't have to belong to a church or synagogue or something. You can develop a personal spirituality based entirely on contact with the objective psyche. And this is another way in which Jung's approach to spirituality is actually incompatible with the traditional theistic systems. There are some other ways as well. For example, Jung thought that the transpersonal self, the inner divine, the image of God that we have, cannot be thought to have just a light side. It has a dark side and a light side. So, for example, the traditions talk about God as loving and so on, and certainly that is obviously correct. But it's Jung would say it's a partial description, and if you look at horrific, say, historical events like the Holocaust or the current pandemic, Jung would say these are examples of the dark side of the self. They are more than purely human. They are on such a vast scale and they cause such terrible suffering that we can't attribute them to purely human factors. So that he thought that our image of God has to have a dark side to it. And so, for example, the image of Christ is only a partial image of the self because it's too light, it's too exclusively light. It's not that it's wrong. He would say it's only partial. You have, otherwise you have to split off evil and project it onto the devil or the Antichrist. And what he wants to do is have a God image that includes a light side and a dark side. And this is another reason that he got in trouble with Victor White and Buber. And it's an unpopular idea that the divine could have a dark side to it.
Well, it's ironical because the father of modern psychology, Schleiermacher, said that he encouraged, right, no more secondhand religion.
Oh, yes, yes.
Important for us to have a direct experience of the divine.
Yeah, Schleiermacher is one of Jung's spiritual ancestors. I mean, the emphasis on feeling is very important.
Yeah. And can you speak to how the pandemic might be a collective numinous experience?
Well, just look at the shape of the coronavirus. It's a perfect sphere. And the sphere is an example of mandala imagery. And then so it's certainly a self symbol. And if you think about the fact that the problem emerged from bats, which live in deep, dark, underground caverns and caves. I mean, just imagine it symbolically. You have the emergence from the underworld into our reality of something very, very damaging in the form of the self, in the form of a spherical mandala. It's actually a perfect example of the dark side of the self. And the problem is, but I mean, if you set this traditional theist who thinks that God is only love and light, I think it's the first letter of John that says he is only light and in him there is no darkness. If you take that view of God, this is going to be anathema to say that this pandemic is an example of the dark side of God. I mean, that would be a terrible thing to say.
Well, it's interesting because our metaphor is that we're at war with this virus.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Jung would agree with that metaphor, or that way of understanding what's happening right now.
It's not a good metaphor. Because we have to respond to the pandemic at the same time as we accept it as somehow necessary. Acceptance means that you respond to it without responding just out of rage. Mm-hmm. That you try to deal with it. Obviously, we have to try to deal with it, but you have to understand what it means, what it's pointing to, why it happened, what the telos is, the goal that it's aiming at, that it's the result of a larger intelligence, and what do we learn from it, and so on. That's what I mean by accepting that somehow this is necessary. And the war metaphor is very limited. It's not a good one.
Some have suggested we're moving from an age of independence to an age of interdependence. And that mandala image of the virus, I think, is a very powerful image in relation to that. Could you maybe speak to perhaps maybe there's a shifting? Jung said maybe it would take 500-600 years for this shifting to occur, but could you talk about this? Maybe we're at the beginning of it.
Yeah, well, well, how can I say? There's an idea that I think was first suggested by Edward Edinger, who was a Los Angeles analyst in the 80s, that Jung's approach to spirituality is what Edinger called the new dispensation, by which he meant in the West, not in the East so much, but in the West, that there's a new way in which divine grace is dispensed or emerging into the world. just roughly to summarize Edinger, the first dispensation was the revelation at Mount Sinai. The second was the appearance of Christ. But the new one is this sense that we're in touch with the objective psyche, with the mythopoetic level of the psyche, having these kind of experiences. And that is the beginning, essentially, of a new religious form. So your question is really, how long will this take to emerge into the culture? And there is some evidence, although not very much, but that it will take a few hundred years. That in Max Zeller's book on dreams, he says he asked Jung, he told Jung about a dream in which a temple is being built. And I think just the foundations had been laid. And he asked Jung if this was the foundations of a new spiritual form and perhaps a new religious form. And Jung said he'd heard similar dreams, but that he thought it would be, I think he said 600 years or something before this thing is built, this new temple is built. So if this idea is correct, and some people object to it, they want psychotherapy and so on and psychology to be a purely secular pursuit. But if this theory is correct, then we're only at the very beginning of this. So we're just laying the foundations to it. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. But it for many people already, this is a personal spiritual practice, being in touch with this kind of work.
Yes, yes. It seems that one of my teachers, Edgar Brightman, suggested that philosophy must concern itself with all accessible experience.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that's what Jung insisted upon, that if we neglect the facts, as Lao Tzu suggests, then there will be disaster. And it seems as if our secular society, our institutions, I ask my students, how many of you trust your religious institutions? And hundreds of them now, zero. Yeah. Political, economic institute, zero. They don't trust institutions.
Yeah, well, this is where Jung is useful, because there are many people who have a personal sense of the sacred, but they can't trust an institution. They don't, the politics don't work for them, or the particular God image of the institution doesn't work for them. They don't accept the Bible stories, for example, as literal history. At best, they're mythological stories. So if you can't believe any of the traditional stories, and you have a personal sense of the sacred, where do you go? Well, Jung's approach is one place to go.
Yeah, they're ancient philosophers, and often he said if oxen, horses had hands and could draw, their gods looked like oxes and horses.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when my students come up and declare their atheism, I say, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because I probably don't believe in that one either.
Yes, exactly. They're repudiating the traditional theistic God image.
Exactly.
But this approach of Jung has nothing to do with that. You may have, as we've seen, you may have God images that are nothing like the traditional God image. So this really is a new mythic image of God. It's quite radically new. And in the Red Book, Jung says a new image of God is being born in the human soul, albeit against resistance, because it's hard to change the way of thinking that one was raised in. It's no coincidence that in the Red Book that the figures that appear to Jung are figures like Elijah and Salome. These are very important in the evolution. Well, Elijah, of course, was very resistant to any new God image. He was a believer in the traditional Yahwistic Hebrew Bible God image.
Right.
He would have resisted this terribly. So Jung had to cope with the Elijah principle, you see,
yes.
for this.
And he was carried away in a chariot of fire.
Yes, which I suspect was a UFO, by the way. But anyway, I'll get in trouble for that.
This is absolutely wonderful, and we really appreciate. Will, any questions that have emerged for you?
Oh, yeah, sure. Swimming in them, of course. Yeah, you know, I'm struck by several situations where the bottom kind of circles back to the top, you know, things like where you talk about going into the individual psyche, and then, you know, in contrast with experiencing a transcendental image, but then talking about how that path kind of can lead into participation in a larger intelligence through the bottom of the self that opens up into. And I wonder if, and the other example is you're talking about, Edinger's idea, and it sounds to me a lot like that idea of the three ages of Judaism and Christianity, right? The idea of the age of the Father, followed the age of the Son, followed by the written example, and then finally the age of the Holy Spirit, follow your own numinous relationship. And it, of course, reminds of Campbell's distinction between a priest and a shaman, the priest being the one who perpetuates the system as it exists, the shaman being the one who develops and cultivates a personal relationship. And part of what I'm wondering is, the West has been on a trajectory of an emerging individual, of increased individuality. And what I wonder is if you think that momentum towards individuality could also be a momentum towards spiritual participation in the numinous and a prioritization of the individual experience. And if this might be the bottom that opens back into the top, and it might lead, and that individual experience of the numinous might actually point us back to a more collective participatory way of being.
Well, no, I think this is a highly individual approach, because everybody's numinous experience is different than everybody else's, although that we may have common features. I mean, people still have numinous visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary or Jesus Christ or whoever is their particular personal divinity, but people have very individual, novel experiences that have nothing to do with traditional iconography. So this is a highly individual approach, and one of the difficulties is that we don't have many communities where people can share these kind of experiences. That's what Psyche and the Sacred is designed to do. The community of the future, say the monastery of the future, won't be geared around a single figure like Christ or the Buddha. It will be geared towards supporting individuals in their own experience of the self, I think. It won't be a collective image anymore. It won't be an external savior like Christ or the Buddha. Pardon me. It will be purely internal.
It's so interesting how you talk about how to get to that place where the individual participation is individual. It requires support of a collective. That to me is really kind of a paradoxical, profound thing, that we have to be more supportive and collective to even support that kind of individualistic and personal relationship. I got to say, is the first time I've listened to you give a similar presentation, and I was in a very intellectual space with it. And now, with everything going on, I'm in a very personal, I'm participating in some of the things you're talking about on my own. And when you talk about Psyche and Sacred, it almost brings tears to my eyes. Like all of a sudden, like, yeah, that container sure sounds nice, and I hope that that's a model for the future you're talking about.
Well, I hope so too.
Well, the tears are good, Will. Goethe once said, "Die and become. Unless you learn this lesson, you'll be just a dull guest on a dark planet." So there's a kind of death and resurrection associated with all this, isn't there? And how does the numinous feed into that kind of death of the ego, or defeat of the ego, and the rebirth of the self with a capital S?
Well, that was one of Jung's comments, that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego, because the ego feels completely overwhelmed by this kind of experience. It's so out of our everyday experience that we are overwhelmed by it.
Speaking of the collective,
we've
reached a point where we're going back and forth, and I think maybe it might be useful or interesting to open our discussion up to those who are in the audience. I think that calling forth the notion of even doing a talk like this on a Wednesday morning, and look at how many people are willing to show up, I think it resonates with this deep call within us for departing from the program that we normally operate our days like, and saying, you know, there's more to life than doing the agenda-driven activities that define us all. And that I may not know what this spiritual component of my psyche is, but I recognize it not only in myself, but others. And it's like religion without a temple, or it's like the world in which I exist is suddenly become my home, and I recognize that I have fellow inhabitants out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a real testament, Lionel, to your grace and intellect that you will share this, not only with us, but that as we go forward into our other talks, these become a foundation of community building. That
I hope so.
You know, I really, what you're doing with Psyche and Sacred is something that ought to be normal, but it's not. We don't have this, we just lack familiarity with a discourse of how to communicate with real spiritual concerns that don't fall into a rational way of being.
Yes. May I just mention our website so that if people are interested, it's simply one word, psycheandthesacred.org.
Mm-hmm. But if anybody has wants to raise a hand or anything like that, I can see it and I can unmute your mic.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that there has been a controversy about whether Jung is trying to start a new religion. And I can imagine that we would be accused of that as well. We're not trying to start a new religion. What we're trying to do is develop a spiritual approach to the psyche or to personal psychological experience that doesn't reduce it. Because nowadays there's a tendency to reduce the psyche to the brain. And very clearly, these experiences are not coming from the brain. They're coming from a spiritual dimension. The brain might be the organ that allows us to experience them, but they're not generated by the brain. So we have to get rid of that materialistic mindset. So we're trying to develop the notion that, as Jung said, the psyche is a domain in its own right, and we can have a spiritual approach to the psyche.
Yes, and we have a comment by one of my favorite writers, Connie Zweig, recommending The Future of Religion by Ken Wilber. And I think, Connie, you now have the connection there with the website to be able to connect. And so how do we normalize this? And it's not a new religion. As a professor of world religions, as a former surfer, I love swimming between the metaphors. And to me, there's a quality of freedom when you allow that energy to emerge in your personal experience. And there's a cage, or as Wittgenstein says, language creates this cage, or these belief systems create a cage if we don't allow ourselves into the psyche. So, Lionel, thank you. So do we have any other questions from any of the attendees here?
Is we have a couple of those come up. If I can ask one more question, and it's you talked about individual experiences, and you also talk about a way of life. And I think that for me, what I find is that these experiences, when they come, they often lead into more experiences and almost become a phase or an episode or a period where you feel a kind of permeableness, and all of a sudden it goes from a dream to a set of dreams to a set of synchronicities to now you're able to project into everything, and then maybe now you're projecting too much and it's everywhere. And while it comes with a certain noetic quality of knowledge, there's also a clear experience that it's beyond your own understanding, and that if you think that you can interpret everything or you're going to get everything right, you're going to be way out of bounds. So I wonder if you could just speak to what it's like as these individual experiences become a series of experiences, maybe any tips for that road.
Well, it's a practice. I mean, you as you have more and more of these experiences, you realize that there's a transpersonal pardon me, you realize there's a transpersonal background. There's a transpersonal background or ground to human existence. That the psyche, which I refer to as consciousness, is the ground of our existence. And part of its manifestation is this kind of experience. And if you have enough of them, they're very, very convincing. You see, the value of this approach is it doesn't depend on belief. You remember when Jung was asked, do you believe in God, in that BBC interview in about 1959, he said, I don't believe, I know. You don't need to believe if you've had the experience. Once Moses had talked to God in the burning bush, nobody would be silly to ask him, do you believe? He knows, he's had the experience. So once you've had enough of these experiences, belief is not necessary anymore. Belief crumbles anyway in the face of adverse life events. Belief is not as solid as knowledge based on individual experience. So that's the result of constantly paying attention to this kind of experience. You can get rid of belief.
And you speak to experience, Lionel.
Yeah.
In many of the traditions, there's a tradition called Lectio Divina, which I think I give most thanks to Pacifica for, because it takes us from the literal to the metaphorical. And Pacifica really opened my eyes, as did Campbell and Jung, to the seeing in metaphors.
Yeah, metaphors very, very
see
important.
the metaphors.
Yeah.
But then Lectio suggests that carries you to a moral level. Then ultimately, as Connie Zwag is bringing up in her comment, to a non-dual kind of experience where you begin to appreciate the interconnection of everything to everything.
Yeah.
That kind of approach?
Well, the relationship between Jung and the non-dual traditions is kind of complicated. In some ways, he's very dualistic. If you insist on the ego-self axis as two different things, that's dualistic. But if you realize, as Jung says, that the self is the totality of the psyche, then you're in a non-dual field. And he also says in other places that the psyche is reality itself. So, but Jung wasn't keen on an exclusively non-dual approach to spirituality, because he felt that if you try and get rid of the ego, that you have unconsciousness. I think that's a mistake. I don't think the Buddha was walking around unconscious. But he was concerned that those kind of Eastern traditions wouldn't work very well for Westerners, but they do actually.
Why don't we see, I have Raina out there. She is our good friend, and I see that I've unmuted her mic, and maybe she would say something.
Hello, everybody. It's good to hear you, Lionel, to be part of this conversation. I have a question regarding the specifically the impact of both spiritual experiences and numinous dreams. I've had them myself throughout my life, and they seem to be incredibly powerful in the moment, and maybe the state will last a few days or have some impact, but at the same time, it seems to be a limited impact. So I'm wondering if there is the sense that those experiences can lead to, I guess in Buddhist terms would be enlightenment, or that kind of radical change, or do you see them as being in some fashion limited?
Well, this is a matter of opinion, but in my opinion, what the Eastern traditions call enlightenment is different than what Jung calls individuation. They're not the same thing. I think the value of these experiences that they act is that they act as a slight course correction. They give you a direction that otherwise you might not take. I'm a bit surprised to hear you say that you don't think they have a lasting effect. don't you think they bring you information? They tell you something you didn't know before?
Absolutely. I agree
Yeah.
that they do. I'm just interested in whether you think that they have a limited scope, in terms of how long they last, or if that the course correction that they imply actually will last a whole lifetime.
Well, I don't know if it has to last a lifetime, but it certainly can change the direction of one's thinking and feeling and behavior. I don't know what you mean by last a lifetime.
Does it have direct implications in terms of changing even your physiology, changing the course of your life, what you decide to do with your life, things like that on a practical level? That's what I mean.
Well, it may convert you from being an atheist into a believer. It can do that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a fairly radical change. It may allow you to feel that your suffering is meaningful. And for me, that's been particular. And for many people that I've worked with therapeutically, if you have an experience like that and you have a sense that your suffering is meaningful, that's much more helpful than thinking that your suffering is just random and meaningless. So just that, I think, is helpful.
Thank you, Raina.
Thank you, Raina.
Thank you. Let's go to the next one. I see. Hi, Lily.
Hi there. I asked the question in the little Q&A box. I wasn't sure about the appropriate way of doing it, and then it subsequently synchronistically ended up talking a little bit about dualism and whether or not Jung would subscribe to a non-dualistic perspective. But when you were talking about the brain being the mode through which the numinous communicates through, that sounds very Cartesian. And I'm wondering if there's potentially a way of, rather than seeing the brain as something that is the organ through which God speaks to us, or however you would put it, that maybe there's an aspect to material that is numinous that we don't often recognize, that we, through our rational scientific interpretation, we want to separate out the material from the numinous, but that material itself is infused with numinosity.
Yes, yes, yeah. Well, when I did say that the brain acts as a kind of. I was quoting William James, actually, who had what he called the reception theory, that the brain acts to receive consciousness the way a radio or a TV set receives a signal and allows us to experience the image. And you're quite right, that's dualistic. I was hoping to avoid a discussion about the mind-brain problem.
Let's save that for one of our talks.
But I just want to point out that that question is very, very important, and I was being dualistic. And my own commitment is much closer to a non-dual approach. But I think that's a huge discussion that could we talk about another time, do you think?
Absolutely.
Just to say the question's very valid, and I realize it was a concession. I just wanted to get out of the idea that everything is coming from the brain. That's a mistake.
I see one more question in here from Psyche. Let's see if I've unmuted it. Unmute. Okay. No? Unmute. All right, go ahead. How come? Sorry. There we are. Satya Keys?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, to Dr. Corbett. Great stuff. I'm a Pacifica alumni, and also to Will. Shout out to Will for helping out with this. My question is basically based in practical ways to actually arrange for allowing more of the numinous experience to happen through proper meditation. And what I mean by proper meditation is different than mainstream meditation in the American quote way of thinking of meditation. And I'm talking about it basically as a witnessing experience, awareness and experience. And my question is, the meditations of Osho, the enlightened mystic, are very much at hand and available and in the whole world. And I'm wondering if depth psychology has not looked at Osho's work or some of the other mystics that are living or that may have lived recently, as to how to be practical in being able to support the numinous experience that points to transcendence into the objective psyche. Meditation is very much a tool for this, and I'm wondering why meditation is not more in the academic realm of understanding that this is something we can do together with studying depth psychology.
Well, I've known lots of people who've spent many years meditating and they've never had a numinous experience. So the goal of meditation is not to have a certain state of mind or a numinous experience. In fact, real meditation doesn't have any goal.
That's accurate.
I think we're talking about two different approaches here. I agree that they complement each other, but they shouldn't be conflated. These experiences may occur spontaneously for no obvious reason, and you can meditate till you're blue in the face and never have one of these experiences. So I think at the moment these are parallel tracks.
Mhm.
Can I ask, do you think that meditation may be a useful method for containing and evaluating numinous experiences in a kind of tandem relationship?
It depends how you meditate, but typically when people meditate, there is no focusing on content. That's one of the main differences. I mean, when you have a numinous dream, pardon me, I'm sorry. When you have a numinous dream, you deliberately focus on the content. When you meditate, you just let the contents pass by without focusing on them. So these are just two ways of handling the material, and they're radically different. They're both valid and important, but they shouldn't be conflated.
They can be complementary.
They can be complementary, yes.
Yeah, my teacher Thomas Keating said that meditation sort of softens the psyche. It creates a permeability. It creates a malleability, which
Yes.
I think is appropriate for a psyche wanting to connect with the numinous.
Yes, I agree. I meditate as well as paying attention to this kind of thing, but I don't think they're the same.
No. In India, they suggest 4 different yogas, and each of those yogas has, if you will, a different approach to the experience of spirituality.
Yeah.
But they're not oppositional. They're complementary.
Yeah.
So the idea of with all my heart, mind, body, and soul suggests, again, the mandala of the whole psyche, which I think
Yeah. And I think paying attention to this kind of material is actually a form of yoga, where yoga means connection.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't it also suggest that the content, the deep source of this is archetypal, and that we
Deep source of what is archetypal?
The spiritual content, and so we will see various people practicing doing this, or we will read something and it will resonate with us as a parallel to that. But all of that seems to be coming out of a sense that it's beyond the human self, and it comes from the divine nature of existence, that something out there is calling us. and that whoever is acting as a guide or a shaman or a guru is in their own personal best way trying to access that archetypal content. And that when we come in contact with them, we resonate with it because it's archetypally situated within ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. The archetypal dimension, I'm very sorry about my voice. The archetypal dimension is the spiritual dimension.
Mm-hmm.
In the Zarathustra seminars, Jung says that the archetypes are organs of God or tools of God.
Mm-hmm.
There's no difference. We don't want to violate Occam's razor here. We're talking about the same thing, not different entities.
So returning to Raina's point, is there a suggestion that there's a evolutionary development of the psyche here that's underway, and that there's, Eric Neumann talks about stadial succession of the archetypes?
There's an evolution in our imagery. Our image of God is evolving. I mean, it has been evolving since our early hominin ancestors. They had a God image gradually, and then we had the Sumerian and Babylonian gods, and then the Hebrew Bible, and then the Christian God image. I mean, obviously, we've had the evolution of God images. So this is just another step.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of Edinger's point, really, that this is now to say that the divine itself is evolving, that would be meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
So all we can say is that our images of the divine are evolving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On
Okay.
that, can I ask one other little piece to that, to ask you to expand on it? You described synchronicity as when the outer and the inner are mimetic with each other. And I wonder if, just extending that point you just made, if we might see this as a kind of collective synchronicity, a moment where our collective inner experience is finding a mimesis with an external participation, and how important those alignments are as big jumps and leaps and in that evolution you're describing.
Yeah, well, I guess the fact that we're doing this is synchronistically important in some way. Yes, thanks to Dana for arranging it.
Yeah, so we want to bring this to a close. And Lionel, what can we say? But you have been a great blessing to many, many, many souls.
Thank you.
And we appreciate the work that you do, the passion you bring to your work, and the opportunity for us to be pioneers in this sort of development of understanding the numinous. And Dana, what can we say to you? But thank you for bringing us all together around the Myth Salon in so many ways. You have been you've been a kind of Hermes figure, a kind of a messenger, and we appreciate you helping the message to manifest. And Will, thank you so much for your participation. I don't think I was in your class, but I feel like I would have enjoyed being in your class. And thank you to all the participants who've been here today. And we look forward to the next session, which we've not quite determined, right, Dana, what it will be about, but we know there's going to be a great deal of content.
Well, we'll have emails that will go out. Lionel and I will discuss what we think is the next most popular among his talks. We want to bring all of these out in a way that they are available for people. They're available to participate. They're available for viewing wherever you happen to be. Today we have Vicky Joe from England, Annabelle from Paris, who are both people that came to the Myth Salon and thanked us for coming out on a Wednesday morning. And there are a lot of people here who have stopped their day or started their day around this. So I thank everyone. This is immensely gratifying. And I just feel like it's wonderful to be able to swim at the edges of this numinous content and to have somebody as qualified as Lionel and Gard and Will for me to be a playmate with. So on that note, I'll wish you all well, and we will see you in a week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.